What's up guys, I've decided to put focus into some other video projects, and I am temporarily taking a break from my Simpsons and Me videos until probably the spring. And so for the season finale of Simpsons and Me, I wanted to do a change of pace, and instead of looking at an episode purely on its own, I wanted to get into the whole background of an episode that had been brewing since the show's inception. This is Two Bad Neighbors. So I was born in 1991, around when the Simpsons' third season was airing, and I wasn't even really able to cognitively register what I was watching on television until about 96-97. So when I first saw Two Bad Neighbors in syndication, the whole context of the episode was completely lost on me. That being said, yeah, I knew who George Bush was. I was aware that George Bush was president of the United States at some point in time. I think the earliest point where I had heard his name was in an old episode of Animaniacs.
President Bush said, "Read my lips."
But I had no real knowledge of his position as a Republican or any of his policies or anything related to what a president actually was. And let's be real, I still don't. But I just found it funny that Homer and this old guy hated each other. It was an episode I found funny despite being left out of the actual context of the episode for the most part. As I grew older, I gained more knowledge of politics and decided that I wanted no part in them. But I was able to learn about George H.W. Bush, and as a result was able to actually understand more of the context of the parodies I had seen on shows like SNL and The Simpsons. But little did I know that in my earliest years, The Simpsons was actually a subject of controversy which included George H.W. Bush. People tend to forget that The Simpsons, as popular as it was, as popular as it is, as popular as it ever will remain, peaked pretty early on. You look at the viewer numbers from seasons 1 to 4, and it was literally on fucking fire. Even though contemporaries speak of the mid-later early years as being the best seasons, its peak was during Bart Mania in the early 90s. Like, look at the numbers of seasons 1 to 4 and maybe 5, and, you know, compare it to the numbers that it was getting season 6 and onwards. If we're speaking purely based on television ratings, peak Simpsons is only the first 4 or 5 years. And yeah, let's talk about Bartmania real quick. Bartmania refers to a period of time where Bart Simpson was fucking everywhere. He was just plastered on merch, products, and even the Macy's parade. Bart Simpson was the original breakout character of the show and is one of the defining images of early 90s pop culture. Of course, later on, Homer would become the series mascot character, but Bart was who they pretty much built the entire show around, at least from a merchandising and presentation standpoint in the beginning. Seriously, for any younger generations that may watch this, you have no idea the power that Bart Simpson had in the fucking 90s. It was insane. In fact, there were complaints from a lot of parents groups that Bart Simpson was a bad influence on kids, as he was described as an underachiever and proud of it. And he often backtalked adults.
And, what's your name, son?
Well, I'm Bart Simpson. Who the hell are you?
I'm Dave Shutton. I'm an investigative reporter who's on the road a lot, and, I must say that in my day, we didn't talk that way to our elders.
Well, this is my day, and we do, sir.
And got into mischiefs. Many concerned citizens thought that Bart would corrupt the youth of the generation. And that's why I love Bart Mania, because Bart Simpson represented more than just backtalk and mischief. Bart Simpson is probably one of the anti-authority icons of the 1990s, along with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Bart taught us that it was cool to not listen to your parents, and that's what concerned boomers the most. So many people I know born in the 70s and 80s that aren't even boomers, just Gen X's, still have that gotta respect your parents because they're your parents attitude. But my generation, I think by the time I was in middle school, kids realized, hey, I really don't have to do what my parents tell me all the time. I even remember my parents telling me, if I had acted like you did at your age, my parents would have done nothing. It got to a point when I was like, just before I was a teenager, where my parents would try to ground me for like something stupid. I'd be like, nah, no thanks, and I'd just like leave the house, and they'd fold faster than Superman on laundry day. Anyway, back on topic. Because of the influence of Bart Simpson, a bunch of parents decided that The Simpsons had to go, and there were letters sent to Fox, and concerned parent groups started making the show a topic of discussion. Bart was of course a major part of this, considering he appealed to the youth, but much like The Simpsons' sister program Married with Children, The Simpsons was criticized for showing the antithesis of what the American family should be. People didn't want to see shows that taught a lesson and showed family values anymore. The time for that was long past. The Cosby Show show was on its way out, Reagan was gone, Cold War was over, Americans had nobody looked down upon anymore but themselves. But some people weren't willing to accept that, and the show became such a target. It's funny though, because all these parent groups were like, oh, you know, Bart Simpson with the... And it's like, if they actually watched the show and like took in what was on the TV instead of like just being outraged over a joke, they would have realized that yes, well, Bart was depicted as an underachieving troublemaker who backtalked adults and his parents. It also showed that his behavior had negative repercussions. But as we all know, in America, people will complain about something without actually understanding it firsthand. You'd see this behavior specifically from groups of right-leaning American families. The whole thing just boiled over eventually when Republican First Lady Barbara Bush referred to The Simpsons as the stupidest thing she had ever seen in an interview with People magazine in 1990. This led to a little back and forth where Simpsons writers sent Barbara Bush an in-character letter from Marge Simpson.
Dear First Lady, I recently read your criticism of my family. I was deeply hurt. Heaven knows we're far from perfect. If truth be known, maybe just a wee bit short of normal. But as Dr. Seuss says, a person is a person. I try to teach my children, Bart, Lisa, even little Maggie, always give somebody the benefit of the doubt and not talk badly about them, even if they're rich. It's hard to get them to understand this advice when the very first lady in the country calls us not only dumb, but the dumbest thing she ever saw. Ma'am, if we're the dumbest thing you ever saw, Washington must be a good deal different than what they teach us at the current events group at the church. I always believed in my heart that we had a great deal in common, each of us living our lives to serve an exceptional man. I hope there is some way out of this controversy. I thought perhaps it would be a good start to just speak my mind. With great respect, Marge Simpson.
And in response, Barbara Bush wrote an apology back, and that was that for now. The crusade against The Simpsons was still around, but we heard no more from the First Lady. 2 years later, however, when George Bush was running for re-election, much of his campaign was based on the idea of preserving old American family values, which is the easiest string to pull with the upper-middle, conservative white American. And during his speech, he dropped this bombshell.
Going to keep on trying to strengthen the American family, to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons.
The Simpsons would fire back with their own response during a repeat airing of Stark Raving Dad, with Bart stating,
Hey, we're just like the Waltons. We're praying for an end to the Depression, too.
did someone in the Bush campaign staff just like have it out for this show? Because it's like, what, did their son tell him to eat his shorts or something? And then they were like, oh, you need to say something about the Simpsons, Mr. President. They're killing today's youth. Nevertheless, George Bush did not win the election, Bill Clinton did, and it seemed as soon as George Bush vacated office in 1993, most of the outrage with The Simpsons kind of died down. Like, you'd get the odd parent complaining about The Simpsons, mostly due to Bart Simpson's portrayal and how kids looked at him, but also due to the show's portrayal of a highly dysfunctional American family. But newsflash, most families are dysfunctional. In the end, The Simpsons weathered the storm of criticism from moral guardians who would move on to attempt to stop some other form of media. The whole Bush versus Simpsons feud was quickly forgotten, and as most forms of media were quick to start parodying the new president, Bill Clinton, and The Simpsons were no exception. You see why I think political satire is the lowest form of humor? That is, until about 3 years later, which probably went into production about 2 years later, you know, a year before it aired, when finally the big payoff to all this rhubarb came in the form of the season 7 episode, Two Bad Neighbors. Now you could say it was a little bit late, and it was, but it still stands as a very memorable episode within season 7, which in and of itself is a season full of highlights. It was finally time. After years of build-up, we were getting the showdown between The Simpsons and former President George Bush. But there was a catch to it. As I mentioned just a little bit earlier, Bart was the mascot character for the show in the early years. He was on all the merch, he was in all the commercials, and he was essentially the face of the brand. But by this time, Homer Simpson was sort of beginning to take that role as the face of the show. George Bush's initial outrage was during Bart Mania. The interpretation we get of Bart here doesn't really line up with Bart Mania Bart. It is a weird nitpick, but it feels like the Bart character evolved past what the outrage over his character was in the day while the whole Bush feud was going. But that's okay, because according to the commentary, the actual conception of this episode wasn't to pay off the Bush-Simpsons feud, it was to have a normal person react to being around Homer, and the writers realized that George Bush was enough of a non-memorable president that they could get away with it. Ouch.
Hey, neighbors, I'm George Bush. Former President George Bush?
I guess I get it though. For one, it has to be a more modern president, but also not the current president because that wouldn't make much sense. It couldn't be Carter because he's too much of a low-hanging fruit.
I give you our 39th president, Jimmy Carter.
Oh, come on! He's history's greatest monster!
It couldn't be Reagan because he was popular amongst the more right-leaning Americans, and a negative portrayal could have hurt the show's ratings. And Richard Nixon was a target for the show several times in prior years, but he was dead at this point. So, you know, George Bush was really the only option, and, you know, learning that this wasn't intended to be a payoff to that feud actually kinda damages the episode for me. So, of course, being The Simpsons, it never jumps right into the main plot. They always give us a little opening plot, and this one concerns a rummage sale, and it's nothing really to write home about. The opening with Homer watching TV has a really good point. Saturday afternoon TV was the fucking worst.
You know, this year everyone's abuzz about one thing, the absence of Mark Rodkin. Oh wait, there he is.
I kind of appreciate the attic scene and the rummage sale scene a little bit more because of the slew of callbacks to previous episodes contained in both of these scenes. You get the Head from Blood feud, a bunch of B Sharp's albums, Simpson and Son revitalizing Tonic, the I Didn't Do It t-shirts, the Maryworth phone, and the little Lisa Lionheart dolls, all on display. Also, first appearance of Disco Stew, a character that contributed fucking nothing to the show. I really don't know what to think about Homer's big musical number. It's like really shitty and kind of cheesy, but I think that's the point. Also, I remember from the old Simpsons Political Party VHS tape that had this episode on it, just like constantly rewinding the part where Wiggum's fingers are hitting the keys, because it just like doesn't make sense. Like, what? So finally, at about the 7-minute mark, George Bush finally appears, and we get to see how he's popular in the neighborhood, much to Homer's jealousy, and then we get to the antics with Bart, which it's essentially just a Dennis the Menace parody, and you know, Bart just lives to irritate George Bush, which it's kind of off-brand. Bart's an annoying kid, sure, but I just don't see him wanting to hang around adults, especially not George Bush. Like, him sitting there looking at the pictures and just hanging out is like, I don't know, he's acting more like a 4 or a 5-year-old than a 10-year-old. It's funny in some ways, but it just seems somewhat like out of character for the type of nuisance Bart would be. I am not a fan of them going this route, and I will die on that hill. You hear me complain about characters that are kids not acting like kids, and now you're hearing me complain about someone acting like too much of a kid, and it just seemed like the writers were like, it'd be funny if it was like a Dennis the Menace parody. They're not Southern, but the thought process was questionable. Questionable and lazy, I think, is like what I'm gonna go with regarding this whole Dennis the Menace thing. It's not the whole episode, but it's like there was like 100 other ways they could have gotten to the point where George Bush spanks Bart or disciplines Bart and sets off the whole feud with Homer. Like, they could have had Bart and his friends just fucking around and like giving him problems. They could have done anything but a fucking Dennis the Menace parody. The only real silver lining with the Dennis the Menace parody is when George Bush's memoirs get destroyed. Like, for some inexplicable reason, me and my friends, we always quote this, but we don't quote it right. We'll just randomly be like, my memoirs, for like no reason. He doesn't like say it like that. He doesn't scream it, but like, I don't know, we're just brain dead, I guess. But even still, like, what he actually does do when the memoirs hit the fan is pretty funny. Just like that groan of defeat. And like, it just, you know, I'm gonna slow-mo it just because it'll be funny. I remember when I first saw this, and Bart's reaction when Bush is pissed is pretty funny. I used to quote that a lot too.
Whoa, man.
Whoa, nothing.
What we're gonna do now is I'm gonna learn you how to play butt ball.
It was like shocking to me to see Bart get spanked, but not only that, like the idea of somebody who like, that's not his parents spanking him. It's like in the modern day, either that person would be getting charges pressed against him or that kid's father would be beating the shit out of him. And it's like, you don't fucking hit another person's kid. It's like, it's just that whole boomer mentality where it's like, you kids need to be spanked or whatever. I just plugged my nose and tried to do George Bush, didn't work. The whole spanking angle leads to kind of a prank war between Bush and the Simpsons, and we get a rare title drop in a Simpsons episode. Two Bad Neighbors operates on your basic Simpsons 3-act structure, and there's no real B-plot in this one unless you count Marge and Barb kind of becoming friends, but they give this point so little time that it's like kind of irrelevant. It shouldn't even really be there. The 3rd-act stretch is just Bush and Homer trying to one-up each other through the pranks after Bush spanked Bart, and it ends with a huge climax and a fight scene. You know, Bush and Homer duking it out in the sewers. The fight scene's actually pretty good. It's not the best fight scene in The Simpsons. Like, this isn't a Homer versus Snake scenario, but it's pretty fun, it's comedic, and I love seeing Homer break the laws of physics. You can tell the writers had some degree of respect for Barr after the whole letter incident, because in the story, the whole conflict is ended when George Bush is henpecked by his wife into apologizing after Gorbachev sees him strangling Homer. And then Bush moves out, and that's the end of the episode, but we get a tease for another story that never ends up becoming an episode, with Gerald Ford appearing at the end. This quote is another personal favorite between me and some friends.
Say, Homer, do you like football?
Do I ever?
Do you like nachos?
Yes, Mr. Ford.
Well, why don't you come over and watch the game and we'll have nachos? And then some beer.
It's funny. I don't know. This episode's very quotable despite the negative things I've said about it. Sometimes I like to imagine what it would be like if the Gerald Ford episode was a follow-up a little bit later down the line, and you know, through my discovery, I actually found something really weird out. In some syndication markets, the advertisement for reruns of Two Bad Neighbors completely framed it like Gerald Ford was part of the central plot, which he wasn't. He was literally in the fucking episode for like 20 seconds, if that. Two Bad Neighbors may not have been directly intended to work off of the former Bush and Simpsons feud of the early 90s, but it certainly felt like the payoff to that short-lived tiff in the Simpsons' early years. As an episode, it's pretty funny. For those who aren't completely aware of Bush's presidential run, we laugh because watching Bart and later Homer go at him with cartoonish antics is pretty hilarious. But for those who are invested in politics, get a life. Nah, for those who are invested in politics, the little jabs at his presidential run are pretty funny. I understand some of them, like the Japanese banquet one specifically, because he threw up on the premiere or something of Japan, and some of the other little jokes I kinda get, but it's not necessary to be fully engrossed in American politics in order to enjoy this episode. While the episode has some pretty funny parts, it suffers from what I like to call the South Park effect. What is the South Park effect, you may ask? Well, the South Park effect is when the subject matter of an episode ages at an accelerated pace. Like, the episode itself missed out on the Bush administration by 3 years. Like, by the time it came out, Clinton was almost done his first term. So later generations won't really get most of the references unless they really looked into politics at some point. In South Park's case, it's like their writing style is they try to play off of current events, but that's the problem with current events. They will always be stuck in the past because there's always more current events. I don't know if I could really call George Bush, current events at this point in time, but it just really ages. Like, most people probably, younger people would be like, oh, George W. Bush or whatever. And it doesn't really hurt the episode too bad, but there's a reason I kind of go back to seasons 4 and 5 when I go back to The Simpsons, because it's like they do reference things of the time period, but for the most part, it's not really, you don't need to be understanding of that era to enjoy those episodes. Whereas something like Two Bad Neighbors might have that problem later on. Two Bad Neighbors does keep itself kind of afloat by being somewhat funny. It has a few of those little jokes, which I mean, something that you might not laugh at the first time around, but upon rewatching it, you'll think, oh, that's actually kind of funny. The biggest one for me is the entire sequence in the drive-thru, like Homer rushing because,
oh man, I only got 1 minute till they stop serving those breakfast balls.
Which, what are breakfast balls, and why hasn't anybody made breakfast balls? But it doesn't stop there. This one might fly over some people's heads, but when Bush is holding up the line because he's old-fashioned and he won't get the cheeseburger,
That's really more of a weekend thing, Ray.
I don't know why, but it's always reminded me of my great-grandfather, who was an old-fashioned Depression-era guy, and I just kind of pictured him saying this for some reason. It's just, I don't know, it's funny. But honestly, aside from the stuff that already made me laugh, upon rewatching this, I didn't end up enjoying it as much as I used to, and I think it's because it was on a lot in syndication. I had it on DVD. I had the Simpsons Political Party VHS tape. Like, it's still funny, I don't think it's a bad episode, but when compared to the rest of season 7, it's kind of lower on the scale of quality. One of my major complaints, besides all the stuff I mentioned, like the off-brand Bart portrayal and the fact that the episode has aged itself, is I really don't like George Bush's voice in this. I'm sorry, I love Harry Shearer. I think he's a very talented voice actor. But when you go on that early 90s SNL deep dive and see Dana Carvey's Bush there, that's like, there's no substitute. That is like the definitive one. They should have just got him to voice Bush. Because yeah, his impression of Bush is iconic. But the Bush voice in this is just like kind of flat. It sounds like they just did a nasally voice with a slight southern accent, and it's just like, feels like Harry Shearer's just reading lines in his booth in his voice, and he's like not really trying to get the mannerisms and the subdued southern accent that Dana Carvey did. It almost felt like Harry Shearer was overdoing the Bush voice, and it's like, I really don't appreciate that, and I get it, it's a cartoon, but still, it would have been perfect for Dana Carvey. With that being said, weighing the good, weighing the bad, I don't feel comfortable giving this episode any more than a 6 out of 10, because yeah, it's flawed, but it's still slightly above average. It's just, it happens to be one of the weaker season 7 episodes to me. And going into this, like pre-rewatch, I had it in my head that this was going to be an 8 because I was just basing it purely on nostalgia. I loved this episode as a kid, but upon a rewatch, it just didn't do all that much for me. Besides the wig part, that will never not be funny. So that was the last supersized Simpsons and Me video for now. I'm gonna come back to it eventually. I just kind of need a bit of time away from The Simpsons because I have a lot of videos cooked up for March and beyond that I want to get done, and I just need to free myself of some of the other shit that I've been doing. So I hope you enjoyed it. It will be back at some point. Until then, like, subscribe, whatever. Check out my other videos. Have a good one.
See now, what do you folks have here, huh? A crusty burger. That doesn't sound too appetizing. What kind of stew do you have today? Well, that's really more of a weekend thing.